Hello, Jane. Nice to see you again.
Hello, Andrew. Good to see you.
Yeah, and hello, everyone who's watching. Nice to see you guys. Thanks so much for tuning in. Today, I would like to say that we are still breaking out of our 1990s fixation, but I'm afraid that might be a bit of a lie because we are going to have a bit of a pirate theme today, aren't we, Jane?
We are,
And
we are, we're very excited.
Yep, and we are going to build it around the 1990s Treasure Island that starred Charlton Heston as Long John Silver and a terrifyingly young Christian Bale as, I was about to say Batman, but that's not right, as Jim Hawkins.
Getting there,
Batman and the Pirates, that would be a new one.
getting there. Yeah, no, it's actually funny because we talked about, well, you and I have talked about pirates for a while, Andrew, as you do, obviously. And we wanted to do a movie, but we were discussing which movie would be good to broaden the discussion around pirates. And I think you suggested Treasure Island, and I think we found that most movies, stories, and so on about pirates kind of links back to Stevenson's original Treasure Island story, doesn't it? Somehow. We have some characters that, someone like Long John Silver, a lot of characters in modern pirate movies seem to have been built around him. There is the entire treasure hunt element that seems to pop in, not so much historically accurate, but it's definitely in most pirate movies, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's actually amazing how much Treasure Island, the novel, dominates our perceptions of piracy. And I mean, for a book published in the late 19th century, that's quite an achievement because there was older pirate literature, but partly taking inspiration from it, but also coming up with some amazing new stuff. I think Stevenson virtually created pirate culture, certainly in the West as we know it today. And you're right about all the things like the buried treasure and the treasure maps, which generally speaking, as far as we know, pirates did not do. But hey, it's great for storytelling and it's a fun activity at kids' parties. So
Definitely, definitely. Do you remember, Andrew, when and how you were first introduced to Stevenson stories? I'm guessing it must have been the book before any film.
Yes, it was. I read Treasure Island at quite a young age. Actually, I was seven, and weirdly enough, the same year I borrowed it from the school library, I was also given it that year for Christmas as a present. So
Oh,
yeah, go figure. The universe was trying to tell me something. And at that age, there were bits of the book I didn't understand because, of course, by the 20th century standards, some of Stevenson's language is a bit archaic. But it was such a good story. I was just hooked. I loved it. But what about you, Jane? Was the book your first introduction?
yes, it was. I don't actually remember when I came across this film, I'm ashamed to say, but it might have been in my late teenage years. So it was probably some years after it came out. But my mum, who was a teacher and a librarian, had this thing about introducing her kids to the classics. So we it was probably her reading it aloud before we could read ourselves, I imagine. And as you say, Andrew, there were lots of things that even in a Danish translation that I didn't quite understand, and also things that were a little bit scary going on along the way. But the plot and everything that happened was so catching, and you just want to read on and on. I do remember that feeling. Could we just have another chapter, please? That feeling I remember very well, because you couldn't really leave it on a cliffhanger, could you?
No, I went through a phase of reading it every year, a few years after I read it, because you wanted the story to be fresh again, but yeah, and that feeling of never wanting it to end, you almost get that disappointment when you get to the last quarter of the book and you think, oh no, the adventure's ending again.
True, true. And there were also concepts that I wasn't aware of were actually quite historically accurate, like the entire leadership choosing and electing a leader among pirates. We do
Yeah.
know that that took place, and that was something Stevenson brought literally on board as well.
Yes, and it's one of the most hotly debated elements of piracy, and I like how the film captures it very well too. Where on one side of the fence, I find you get the people who really emphasize what they call the proto-democratic nature of pirates. And then at the other extreme, you get those who will say, no, they were nothing but a bunch of evil thieves, scoundrels, murderers, rapists, whatever, absolutely mindless animals. And the whole spectrum in between. I mean, I must admit personally, and full disclosure, everyone, so you know where my biases are. I'm leaning more to the more negative side of the spectrum, although I don't occupy the extreme. Because yes, I like how Stevenson's story, and as we see in the film, it captures this lovely essence that you're right, Jane. They have this quite democratic process of choosing leaders, but at the same time, if one of the contenders doesn't like the choice, a pistol shot or a knife in the dark will soon adjust the vote in the correct
Yeah.
direction.
Yes.
And
That's it. That's it. Yes. So much for democracy. Yes.
yeah.
Um, and there, but there were also some really interesting character descriptions because I remember in a lot of children's books at the time, characters were a little black and white. You had a villain, you had a hero, and so to a certain degree, quite two-dimensional. But someone like Long John Silver, and I think there's a reason why he has been more or less used to depict pirates, even in modern times. He's yes, and to a certain degree, a villain, but he's also very charismatic. He's also a leader, and there is also that slightly complicated friendship with young Jim, where he's actually a bit of a mentor. And at the same time, can we really trust him?
Well, yes, this is the interesting thing because I remember in both the book and in the film how put out Jim is when he hears him talking to Dick and he says, "Oh yeah, you're smart as paint, Dick. I've seen
Yes.
that right off." And he's like, "Hang on a minute, it was just a line. You didn't really mean it." But but you're absolutely right. I get this weird sense, and I don't know whether it's just Charlton Heston playing an absolutely blinding Long John Silver, but he seems to like Jim a bit more than the other. So maybe, yes, at the beginning he was starting to manipulate him, but a bit further on in the film, you think there's some actual sincerity when he says, "I like that boy. He's more a man than the rest of you bunch
Yes.
of losers." and yeah, and he does seem to stick by Jim,
Yes.
sometimes out of necessity,
Yes.
sometimes
Yes.
not. But you're
But
absolutely right, Jane. The $64,000 question: can we trust Long John Silver at this very moment?
but he had a very, very good skill and ability for figuring out whose side to be on in the moment.
Yes, he certainly has the survivor's talent. I'll give him that, and he makes it look so easy as well. That it's a funny feeling. I slightly admire him as a character, but at the same time, I find it really unsettling. So you just think, well, when things get tough, you will be standing here on
Yes.
my side of the line, and he'll look at you very sincerely and go, "Oh yes, to be sure, to be sure." And then when the shooting starts, like, Long John.
True, true that. And then I gotta say a plot twist that I actually, even as a child, I think I appreciated this to a certain level. After all the hard work and the hunt and the treasure hunting element, the fact that he dared to have the treasure removed when we finally get to it and then someone has already been there, that
Yes.
that element was brilliant. And at the same time, I've always admired authors who dare to do that because you have this climax and we know it's coming and we know
Yeah.
we will get there at some point, and when you do, it's not bloody there.
No, do you know, I was really shocked the first time I read the book. And I've played the movie for people who've not read the book, and they've been shocked by that moment as well. Because I thought when I read it, and I think a lot of people think when they're going through the book, that that the pirates will find the gold, and then the crew will ambush them while
Yep.
they're too distracted going, yay, lovely gold. So no, the fact that they come and find a hole and it's just, oh, okay. Brilliant piece of writing, absolutely amazing.
And also the following up, because where do you go from there? Everything you've done until that has been about that moment, getting to that moment. So
Yeah.
where do you really take it from there? And I think it was brilliant to actually introduce another character on the island who had sailed with Flint. And because that's a little extra twist to that story that we get into it. And he did that so brilliantly.
Yes, dear old Ben Gunn. It's I quite like him as a character too because it's just that he's so
He's
completely mad. Yeah, fantastically written, and it is so random when he first meets Jim. The first thing he asks is, "Have you got any Parmesan cheese?" I've been on this island for years, and I just want cheese.
That's kind of sweet in a way.
It is, yeah, yeah.
Never mind
Mind
about
you,
saving me. Have you got cheese?
yes, I'd love some cheese. I could pay you in gold, lots of gold. Yeah, but even he has got so much depth because and they capture this beautifully in the film where he sneaks into the pirate camp that
Yes,
night and kills one of them because you sort of come away with the same impression of as Jim to begin with. Oh, sweet old guy who's a bit insane and harmless, and then after that you realize actually the sweet old guy is not as
yeah,
harmless as you think he is, and but it makes sense, formerly part of the most vicious crew on the
yes,
Spanish Main.
yes.
What? Why wouldn't he be handy with a knife? It's
Absolutely, absolutely. No, he's a wonderful character. And there is also, Andrew, what sorry, I keep going on about themes in the story, but we talked about this when we did I think it was Master and Commander, about young Jim who's representing this coming of age young boy into man kind of venture. That's kind of nice as well, because in a way, I think as a reader and as a viewer, he's the one you feel for, really, isn't it?
yes, yeah, and he. Do you know what? Stevenson could have written an adventure story about a boy who goes to sea on a merchant ship and nothing happens to him, but he goes through all the hardship and becomes a man. I think it would have been an amazing book, and I still have read it. But yes, poor Jim, he goes through some really incredible traumas that I think psychologically, aside from all the unpleasantness when the pirates come to the Admiral Benbow Inn, nothing really prepares him for it because you've got the squire who has travelled before, has probably had to deal with pirates and unpleasant things before. You've got the doctor who's the ultimate, Englishman. Nothing phases him. And you've got most of the others who are either good honest seamen or scary pirates. But yeah, then there's poor Jim in the center of this, doing a job he's never done in his life before,
Yeah.
and yes, he has to grow up so fast. I mean, today, gosh, what would happen if someone Jim's age went through that today? You'd at least give them a couple of years counselling when they got back.
Very least, at the very least. And he also needs to figure out along the way who to trust, because he has, as you say, Andrew, some disappointments along the way. I mean, the first time he hears Silver talk, to someone else, the same way he talked to him, there's a little bit of you can see his heart sinks in that moment.
Yeah, yeah, because it was so much pride at the beginning, and it comes through again. The film captures it so
Yeah.
beautifully. That little smile he gives when Silver, here's this experienced war hero sailor who's just told me he thinks I'm a cool guy. It's like, oh yes, I'm doing well.
True,
And they're
true,
like, no,
true.
he lied.
God. Actually, it's funny, Andrew, because I think in maybe we don't get that impression so much in the film, but in the book, the Hispaniola, the ship is kind of a character almost in its own right. And in a way, that's probably the most historically accurate in the film because, or in the story, because there was, I mean, it does represent a typical merchant ship, doesn't it, of the
Yeah.
time?
Yes, yeah, and the description in the book is great because it doesn't give you, doesn't leave too much to your imagination, and I like how Stevenson sprinkles those details in because it just
Yes,
reinforces that as an author, he really knows what he's talking about. So you get a good sense of the ship, and it's so important that he does that because yeah, she is their home and their
yes,
and effectively, I suppose, the stage really for much of
yes.
the book and the film,
That's
and
a good way of putting it. Yes,
yeah, and she does have her little ways and characteristics, but it's a real contrast I find because the people speak in glowing terms of the Hispaniola. Oh, good choice, Squire. She's a good ship, fine vessel, good speed, good handling, and you like to hope that a good ship equates to a happy crew. But to me, it heightens the contrast between
yes.
this beautifully chosen ship and some of the complete scumbags who have sneaked their way under false pretenses into the crew.
Oh, that's a fantastic point, that. And also about the ship being the stage, because you in the story, when you read the book, it's almost a little scary when they have to leave the ship to go on the island, because as you say, it's their home, and it's been their home since they left England, so there is that scary moment of actually leaving her now.
Yes, yeah, and I think one thing that a lot of modern audiences might miss because we live in such a medically advanced age, where when the doctor makes his very pithy observation, certainly in the film when they first sight land, he goes, "I reckon there's fever there,"
Yeah,
um, and that was such a dangerous thing in those days. So to have to abandon the ship and go ashore, you just think, oh,
yeah.
don't cut your hand; it'll get infected. Don't drink certain types of water, it will be bad for you. There's some of the stuff that we just don't think about anymore. They would have been all too aware that they were going into this really hostile environment that Europeans had been known to die in large numbers in. And
And a lot of them never came back.
yeah, yeah.
That was the fact, and even I do remember some of them do develop a fever, don't they?
Yes, they do. The pirates they choose their camp quite badly, and that surprised me a bit in the book because they had been there
Yeah,
before. You'd have thought they would know, but I was thinking about it in the run up to our discussion today, and I think part of the difficulty was Stevenson needed a way of evening the odds as the
yeah,
story progresses because the loyal people from the Hispaniola are so badly outnumbered by the pirates that if the pirates didn't lose anyone to illness or alcoholism or anything like or infighting,
yes.
then they would be in serious trouble.
Yeah.
So yeah, thankfully, I think we'll have to pirates camp here because there's mosquitoes and it's a really stupid thing to
But
do.
actually, in a way, speaking of things that might be historically accurate, those three things were probably the case very often. Illness of various sorts, infight, and alcoholism.
Yes, yeah. Unfortunately, even I think it was a very rare pirate captain who could maintain a level of discipline
Yeah.
among his crew for very long, especially if they were having to do something boring and dangerous
Yes.
with no immediate payoff. So yeah,
And it was, in a way, it was impossible. We talked about that, I think, with Master and Commander as well, Andrew, that you were captain of this little kingdom at sea for however long, and you were in touch with no one else for weeks and weeks and weeks. And as you say, for a long time, it was just pure boredom. There was nothing
mm,
to do. You were just sort of waiting and going to a place you might not even know entirely where it was. Um, it was in many, many ways impossible to maintain any sort of discipline or structure to that.
yeah, yeah. It's and of course, unlike a naval vessel, as a pirate, you've only got your force of person. If you're an officer in the navy, you have a group of
Yes,
marines to make
yeah,
sure that your men behave themselves and don't
yeah,
get too rowdy. If you're a pirate captain, it really is down to your force of personality, and I love the way that the film captures that dynamic because even someone as formidable as Long John Silver has to keep looking over his shoulder
yes.
because someone like George Merry seems to get bored and frustrated after only a couple of days. I should be captain, and it's just like, And it's one of the occasions in the story where I do actually feel for Silver a bit. It's like, look, I'm trying to work on a plan to get us what we want. I don't want to have to be dealing with you every 5 hours coming like, we've had another council and we think you're doing a terrible job.
Let's have 5 minutes to think. Thank you.
Yeah, just, do I have to shoot one of you just to make an example?
Yes. Oh, true, true. But we also, Andrew, if we try to expand a bit on this, because you had a brilliant point. You were doing some work-related study on pirates, and that's how we came to talk about all of this. And a lot of stories, and especially films, deal with especially the European or the Caribbean story of pirates or pirateering. But that's not an awful lot about, for example, Asian pirates or Asian history around this time.
No, you're
And
absolutely right. And we did go looking, didn't we? And we found very little. And that's an amazing point, Jane, because pirates are, as you say, they're a global
yeah,
phenomenon, and one that hasn't gone away. And yet, so many of our cultural perceptions are dominated by the Caribbean.
yes,
Um, yeah, I think at the time I might have just said I think that's partly a legacy of both Empire and Hollywood.
yes.
Um,
Well,
yeah, so the cultural dominance of the Caribbean pirates is a fascinating one, though, because yeah, the character of pirates elsewhere in the world is quite different. So yes, I've been looking. I've only just begun to look into Asian piracy for work, which is a whole new dimension for me. And yeah, you do get Asian pirates who are analogous to their European colleagues. Some of them have, they either successfully run their own ships, or some of the more brilliant ones get a fleet of two or three. But in Asia, you get these pirate kingdoms, which is a very interesting phenomenon. So you get these truly successful, I want to call them warlords. That's not a correct term, really, but it sort of gives you an idea of the sort of thing. I mean, you get someone who's so successful that they manage to amass fleets of sometimes a couple of hundred ships.
oh,
And in order to oversee all this, they actually have their own bureaucracy. It's almost like a government, really. So they are, to all intents and purposes, independent kingdoms, but they have broken away from any sort of recognized authority. And I've been reading. I've only just started doing this, but I've been reading the journals of a gentleman named Cree, who was a doctor in the Royal Navy, and in the 1840s, he is in Asian waters on a British warship. And he makes many observations of their operations against pirates. But what sort of is a measure of the strength of these pirates is that very often even governments that don't necessarily trust each other, like Britain and China, for instance, they often have to join forces just to have enough strength to try and take on these pirate kingdoms. So it's a wonderful contrast to the Caribbean, where you get, a pirate with his ship, or part of a pirate clan, maybe. I'm
yes.
not sure if you can call them that. But whenever the Navy shows up, it's like, oh, it's bad news. We'd better, get out of here. We're outnumbered. Whereas on the other side of the world, the Navy turns up and you go, oh, this is going to be a tough fight because we're outnumbered by the pirates. And some of them are very well armed indeed.
Yes.
It's
Oh my God, I didn't know that. That is interesting. So presumably also, they had, I don't know if I should say better or easier access to wealth, or was it just how things kind of developed? Was it because they were building on a tradition or generations of piracy? Because I'm guessing one pirate, no matter how good he was, couldn't really create his own kingdom in a lifetime, could he? Or could he?
It varies from pirate to pirate. So some of these individuals are spectacularly successful. Others, they inherit dynasties and they gradually add to them over time, and so you get some that are incredibly well established. Ironically enough, sometimes they grow so powerful, and and some of them have armies as well as navies. They actually get hired by I'll call it legitimate governments in the region to do their dirty work for them, or they just get paid protection money because the local non-piratical kingdoms know they're not strong enough to fight them. So but looking the ones that flourished in Asia and around Chinese and southern Japanese waters, you're sitting on so many incredibly rich trade routes
Yes,
that
exactly.
in a way it becomes a self-sustaining thing. You've got the strength to keep picking off these wealthy ships, or you demand that their owners pay protection.
Yes.
And you just keep feeding off that, and then ultimately selling your services out. I suppose there is a European analogy to that in the European habit of issuing letters of marque in wartime. Now, I may upset some people, quite a lot of people, by making that observation, because I do know some academics who, I suppose rightly, they insist on the fine distinction between a privateer and a pirate. It
Yes.
is a very fine distinction, depending on who
Fine
you
line
ask.
between the
But
two. Sometimes a difficult line to spot between the two, but
oh, very, yes. And I think behaviorally,
yeah.
some privateers are on record as having behaved far worse towards prisoners than any pirate ever did. So morally, yeah, it's grey.
Yeah. Oh, that is so interesting, Andrew. But I was wondering if you were sitting there in your own little kingdom with a large fleet, what sort of enemies would you have had? Would it be mostly internal? Would there be people trying to take over, or where did you need to keep an eye?
I would say both internal and external. If you were a particularly successful and good ruler, you'd probably have to worry about younger relatives who would want your throne and your position. But otherwise, if your people were fairly content, it wouldn't be a problem. You had to play a very delicate political game, of course, because if you press too hard on your cash cow, there was always the possibility they might resist. If you were too successful, it might provide an incentive for various kingdoms to come together in alliance against you, or even to bribe some of your colleague pirates who had kingdoms of their own to turn against you. It was a very fluid situation, and in a way, the cooperation between Britain and China that Cree writes about in his journal shows just how fluid the situation could be, because that must have been an awkward alliance, because this Anglo-Chinese naval force forms uh, immediately after the First Opium War. So the British and the Chinese are hardly friends, but sheer necessity and the sheer state of piracy in these waters are what's driven this. So and the Europeans, when they start really trading more in Asia, they tend to bring a bit of this change with them, because they are less inclined to view disruptions to their trade with any kind of tolerance.
Mm.
And because they're just getting into that period where Europeans are beginning to see the world as their oyster, and you bring a slight sense of superiority with you, you don't see why you should pay protection money to some grubby pirate, no matter how powerful they might be. So you're gonna go in there and take them out.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Oh, I didn't know all of that, Andrew. That's fantastic. That I'm just
Yeah.
wondering, it's kind of a shame that, you could make movies out of this, that there must be characters, I'm guessing, in Asian and Japanese history and so on, that are kind of as famous as a lot of those Caribbeans one we've heard of.
Yeah, there are many, and I'm ashamed to say I hardly know any of their names. I mean, I've come across a pirate lord called Shapn Chai, but only because he is mentioned in Cree's journals, and he's
Mm.
one of the people their task force goes after. Um, but I believe that the Chinese and the Japanese both have legends about successful female pirates, one of whom I think, and again, sorry, I don't know her name, but this one actually put herself in charge of a big fleet. So, in the West, we celebrate Mary Read and Anne
Yeah.
Bonny, but they were only ever crew on someone
Yes.
else's pirate ship, whereas this lady got her in Asia, got herself all the way to the top through what must have just been sheer hard work, fair bit of ruthlessness, and a lot of intelligence. So yeah, you're right. It is so strange that we don't get more of a spotlight. And we know from our digging, our preliminary digging, that there are Asian pirate movies out there, but you have to really hunt for them. They're not exactly they're not exactly very well known.
They are, was a bit surprised because the only one I found was the one from 2014, I think. I think it's just called The Pirates and it's Korean. But I
Yes.
haven't heard of it. I'm really ashamed to say I'd never heard of it.
Yeah, I hadn't until you put me onto it. So something to watch. Guys, if any of you have watched any Asian films about pirates, please tell us, because this is something we intend to dig into more. And if you happen to have seen the Korean movie The Pirates, do get busy on the keyboard and tell us what you thought, because
That
I'd
would
love
be
to know.
so interesting to hear also what you think of it. How much of it is fiction? How much is it based on real characters or historical events? And Andrew, did this in sort of the Asian waters, did this take place around the same time as our pirating in the Western world?
Yes, yes. In fact, actually, it may have gone on for a bit longer because, as far as we know, there were so many well-developed cultures trading in Asia long before Europeans colonized the Americas that piracy was always a problem out there. And I think that's partly why it feeds into the answer as to why some of these Asian pirate organizations, and I'll call them kingdoms, were so well developed, because they had had centuries of lead up time, and they'd always been there. Whereas, even if they started from fairly humble beginnings, whereas I think the golden age of piracy, as Europeans understand, is this very specific period, isn't it? From the very end of the 17th century to, if you're being generous, the middle of the 90. No, actually, it would have ended earlier than that. It's barely more than 100 years, is it
Yes,
really, the
yeah.
golden
It's actually a
century of
rather brief
piracy?
period of time when you think about it.
Yeah. So,
Well,
so in a sense, the European style pirates never really have this opportunity to develop the same kind of thing.
but it's funny when to hear you talk about this, Andrew, because in a way it makes me think that Asian piracy would have had to be a lot more organized and structured. I mean, sometimes especially in the Caribbean, you had like one man with a ship, and that was it, and a crew, and that was it. Whereas if you had to organize these mini kingdoms and trade routes and all of that going on, there would have been a fairly strict structure to that entire government.
Yes, they seem to have had a bit more than European pirates, by way of I'll call them codified rules, because some European pirates did have their own codes of conduct. I don't think they were written down, but they had them, and some
They're
were
more
quite
like
strict.
guidelines anyway.
They'd be more like guidelines anyway, as you say. Yes, whereas some of the pirate organizations in Asia had to have some kind of codify, even if it was just a set of bullet point rules. Don't be rude to your superior or something, because the pirate king has placed him over you, and if you have a problem with him, it's the pirate king's job to punish him. Yeah, but it seems to have varied, because they had rules for certain things by way of maintaining discipline and efficiency. And ironically enough, some of them did a real downer on corruption, because, of course, your chieftain wants all the money
Yeah.
and the right to distribute it. So don't you go pocketing stuff when you're out collecting. But very few of them had any kind of rules governing conduct towards prisoners. So the treatment of captives and hostages in Asian waters, as far as we know, was every bit as brutal as it was in the Caribbean and other places. And women, children, and civilians generally, unfortunately, are fair game, because they're little better than property or ransomable goods. So,
Did you, this might be a bit of a weird question, Anne, but did you go into piracy for the same reasons in Asia that you did in perhaps Europe and in the Caribbean? Or was there because you say there were some amazing trade routes in some of the Asian areas. was it mainly to gain money, property, wealth, or were you perhaps sometimes forced into piracy, perhaps as a prisoner or something, even in those areas?
It's a bit of everything, and again, a lot depends on the individual pirates and their organization. So, the lure of wealth was
Yeah,
certainly there. I mean, it was a very risky life, but as in the Caribbean, but it was also it was basically high risk, high reward.
yeah.
And certainly in Asian waters, the chances of high reward were higher, I think. And I base that simply on the much denser volume of trade, of valuable trade. Um, so yeah, you could get rich quite quick. In the case of some of these communities, you if you were born into, say, a pirate kingdom, it was very often the expected thing that you
Yeah.
would just end up in that line of work, either doing it directly or in a support. Today we call it logistical services, but you're born into that organization, so you kind of have to go with it, really. Yeah, and I don't know enough about Chinese attitudes towards, or indeed Asian pirates in general, their attitudes towards using prisoners. But I need to read up more about that. But I do know that prisoners were mostly valued for their ransom value,
Yeah.
and even in the 20th century, there was a sort of ranking order. Europeans were perceived to be of the highest value for ransom purposes, well-to-do Chinese a bit below that, because they would very often raid passenger steamers in the hope of
Yeah.
grabbing prisoners. And we've got photos. I've seen photos of, and this looks really incongruous, but you've got modern steamships in the 1920s with anti-pirate defenses where it's sharpened metal stakes with
Yes.
lockable gates closing off the promenade decks, and you'd sometimes have hired guards with
Yes.
rifles. Just to, yeah, so the nature of the piracy evolves, but in some way it never changes, and neither do the motivations, I think, or what's behind them.
Oh, Andrew, this is so interesting. Sorry, I just keep asking you questions, but do you know if there were there differences or sort of substantial differences in terms of the vessels in these areas? I mean, we kind of know about the merchant ships of the West and so on, but did the Asian ships need to have other kind of skills at sea in the Asian waters and maybe therefore look differently or?
Oh, it was very different. It depended on which culture you were from, because most of Asia has a really rich maritime heritage. I mean, it's fascinating how some of their practices diverge quite significantly from European ones, but you can often put that down to local conditions. So in many respects, when I suppose when you're looking at the golden age of piracy, in essence, there's not too much difference to the ships in broad concept. The Indians have their very large trading couriers. You get and they sort of take over from the goods coming in from Arabia and sort of spread them around the Indian Ocean and into Asia. And you'd start bumping up against Chinese trading junks of various sizes. And this is despite the imperial Chinese government's attempts to curb their own maritime development, a very badly thought out policy. But you'd always have the Chinese coastal trades and trading around Southeast Asia. So you get a plethora of different ship types. And then, of course, from the 15th, 16th centuries onwards, you see more European ships in these
Yeah.
waters too. So you get this wonderful mix. It's very, very cosmopolitan in terms of ship types.
Yes.
As for what the pirates use, it again varies by pirates. The Chinese pirates tended to use converted merchant junks as their vessel of choice for the longest time. Certainly, when our friend Cree was writing his journal, they still very often used sail-powered junks to. They didn't really have anything else, and they'd known nothing else for centuries. It was Europeans who introduced Chinese pirates to the steam engine. So,
Yeah.
but they take to steam engines quite quickly. You know, what once as the 19th century gives way to the 20th, you get more enterprising Chinese pirates using converted steamships for their
Oh,
purposes. Some of them even go so far as to ambush government vessels so
yeah.
that they can steal their flags and identification
Yes.
codes and pretend to be someone official, which is extremely naughty, but pirate.
Absolutely. Oh, wow. Oh, that is so fascinating, Andrew. Oh, thank you for sharing all of that. That was really great. I didn't know any of that. I feel that should be part of the history book somehow.
Well, I would like to learn more because, as I say, I'm only really a couple of weeks into this incredible journey of trying to learn more about Asian piracy. I mean, I've kind of encountered it because I studying the Royal Navy and some of the related navies, you get the Navy's perspective when they're going through the frustration of trying to hunt these people down and keep them under control. But it would be nice to see what the view was like from the
Yes,
other side of the table, and I'm looking forward to that.
so true.
Um, yeah, and also it has, as you rightly raised the question, how have we come to the pass where, much as we love European piracy in a literary sense,
Yes,
it has come to dominate. Because if you say the word pirate to most people, even non-Europeans, chances are they will probably think of a guy with a hat, a parrot, and a wooden leg.
that's kind of it. And then, if you know anything, you might have heard of characters like, as you say, the women and Bonnie and Blackbeard, those kind of types, that we know a little bit of from history. But I think that's where we go first, isn't it? I mean, I hadn't even, I knew, of course, there were piracy taking place in Asia, but I had no idea about all of that. And I feel a bit like that's lacking in our history books in the West, isn't it?
Well, it is, but to be honest, I don't know how much work has been done in Asia on the
Mm.
on the story of piracy. It's
Yeah,
they yeah they've sort of always been there. They after World War II, they were definitely no longer as overt as they used to be. But
no. There is an element, Andrew, of piracy that we haven't really touched on, but I guess in both literature and fiction, it kind of plays a role as well, which is that of mutiny. And we talked a little bit about another movie that came to mind as well, which we both loved, The Bounty, which is, of course, based on a historical event that we also don't know that much about, but we do know this took place. The mutiny on the Bounty, probably the most famous mutiny. And there is, I suppose, an element of piracy in mutiny as well, isn't there?
yes, there is. It's a fascinating question. Again, it depends who you ask, because I get the impression that different countries had different legal definitions of what counted as
Yes.
piracy. So if you ask the stricter ones, they would say, yes, mutiny is a form of piracy because you're unlawfully seizing someone else's property on the high seas. Um, Never mind the fact that what you're unlawfully seizing is the ship that you were working on, but it's whereas I think the Royal Navy considers mutiny to be a different thing to
Uh-huh.
it's distinct from piracy, but yeah, it depends who you ask. But you're right. I think in by that definition, because they're stealing effectively, they are stealing
Yes.
a ship. It is an act of piracy, I would say. It's,
And quite often, the punishment would be hanging. Um,
yes, there's yeah,
and,
no
and
no
was quite a
sugarcoating this
serious
one.
thing. But also, as you say, it was quite a. I mean, these little kingdoms at sea, where you very much had a captain who was king. Uh,
Mm.
I mean, it was taking things to the extreme if something like a mutiny took place. And I think that's probably also why the mutiny on the Bounty became so famous, because it was real. We know that it happened, although we don't know exactly the details of it. But it's a fascinating story, and also because we knew with the Bounty, we knew exactly the purpose and the journey of that ship. We knew where it was supposed to go, what it was meant to do. Um,
Mhm.
and then this mutiny took place, and the characters, of course, became rather famous as part of history, and maybe even legends as well around that. Um, but it's a funny thing how that can change the course of history as well, isn't it?
Yes, and indeed lead to the creation of a community. Because
Yeah.
I'm amazed that Pitcairn Island is still the home of the the descendants of
Yes,
Bounty's mutineers. It's an incredible thought.
it is.
Um, yeah, sorry, there is a dimension to the Bounty mutiny as well that is shared with a handful of other mutinies the Royal Navy's had to endure, and it's when the social order that is reinforced is broken down in unexpected ways. So the thing that's really shocking about the Bounty is that the officers, some of the officers, or at least one does in the form
Yes.
of Fletcher Christian, joins in the mutiny, or in his case, leads it.
Yeah.
In one or two other cases, disaffected junior officers did turn on. It was usually a very bad captain,
Yeah.
but what made that so bad was it struck at the established order that was so necessary for maintaining discipline. You could comprehend it if a bad captain and his officers
Yes.
provoked a mutiny among the men. You'd still punish the ringleaders severely, but you would get it, as okay. But it's when these things start happening and the dissatisfaction runs over the cross
Yeah.
section of your shipboard society that was really quite something at the time.
Yeah, no, that is true. That's a good point. And also when you have your group of mutineers, um, as you say, you have to establish a new world order, don't you? Because you might have a natural captain if you have one of the officers joining in, but the entire structure has kind of been turned upside down. And actually, I do love that we get to see that a little bit in the Bounty story, that I mean, another mutiny is not far away. You kind of always have to maintain that discipline, perhaps even harder after a mutiny.
Yes, and that's the ultimate irony of mutinies, I find, because I know of a couple that happened as late as the Second World War. And actually, there's the famous one where there was a mutiny on an American ship during the Vietnam War. But
Yes.
the, the great problem with them, of course, is that once you've committed an act of mutiny, even if you're successful, the door is now open because you
Yeah.
cannot then turn around to a following mutineer and say, "Hey, you can't do that." And they're
Well,
like,
it
you
worked
set a good
once.
example.
It worked once, so why not? Yeah, no, true, true. And it's also there. I guess there is also something fascinating about those stories where men are pressed to the utmost, to the most extreme, and what might they do in attempts to survive, and in sort of attempts to get what they want. And the Bounty was perhaps an extreme story there, and there's no denying there were faults on both sides, I believe. But I think there is also still around pirates, and this is, as you say, the Hollywood perspective of it. There is still a fascination because there is something mythical around them, isn't there? There is something slightly adventurous, romantic around people going to sea and treasure hunting, or seeking wealth, or whatever it might be. There is still that element of adventure, and maybe that's why it continues to be a good story.
I think you're absolutely right, Jane. Yes, because all the themes are present in Treasure Island and in so many of the, I mean, Pirates of the Caribbean, where Jack Sparrow actually sits on the beach and bores poor Elizabeth Swann rigid with his monologue. Oh, it's not just a ship; it's about freedom and going where I want and doing well, being bound to no man and all that. And it is a very attractive notion. I think, especially at the time when societies were really rigid and legal codes were very oppressive, and a lot of people discovered that trying to live the good life and do things legitimately didn't really get you very far. And then suddenly there was this vista of, you could have incredible wealth, you could buy whatever you want. You could go around murdering and stealing for a few years. And then if you go somewhere like Jamaica with enough money, you could buy a plantation and enter the aristocracy. Woo! and yeah, just these things. Freedom, adventure, wealth, the ability to be who you want to be without. And yeah, they keep getting emphasized again and again in a lot of our popular literature. I think there's never really, I find, when it comes to movies, other than Treasure Island and a couple of others, there's never been an attempt to really balance the view that pirates can be quite nasty as well, and and the freedom, what they interpreted at the time as freedom to be who you wanted to be and do what you want, also overlapped with freedom to totally disregard the rules when it came to your fellow human beings.
Yeah, that is true. That is true. That is a very, very good point. Um, and I guess there was also at the time something tempting there's always been something tempting, hasn't there, in seeking new shores. I mean, even if you go all the way back to the Vikings, there was something tempting in the sheer notion that the grass might be greener somewhere else,
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
and that I think can lead many people to do something extreme.
I think you're absolutely right with that one too. Yes, and to put myself in the shoes of an average pirate, not that I'd want to stay there very long, but I do it for a second or two.
I can see that.
If if you're not the captain and your captain's not a talkative type, he's the only one on the ship who knows how to navigate.
Yeah.
Probably, he's the only one who knows where you're going. You're just along for the ride, but while that can be terrifying, there is also that empty horizon with the prospect of wonders that lie on the
Yeah.
other side of it. So yeah, I think that's
That
quite a
is.
good one to put in.
Andrew, this is fantastic. How do we finish off all of this? This has been we're going here and there and everywhere. Is
Oh
this
yeah.
we haven't talked about?
Oh, I can't think. We have. You're right. We've meandered, haven't we? Stevenson would be so proud of us. We sort of launch padded ourselves off him. I suppose the only thing I again, it was a very well made movie, the 1990s Treasure Island. But was there any part of it? And I'm touching on what you said about all the things poor young Jim goes through. Was there any bit in the film that particularly disturbed you, terrified you, made you worried on Jim's behalf, even though you know he's going to come out all right? But
Yes. Oh, that's a good point. Um, Funnily enough, and this might have been because I wasn't very old when I heard it when it was read aloud to me the first time, but I remember how sad I felt when he left his mum behind. And,
yeah,
and that sounds like it's a very little simple thing, but I think that is his first step in this coming of age story journey that he goes on, that at some point we all have to leave our mum, and that feeling, I guess, especially for a child, but that feeling is, that's the first step, that now you're really on your own. Your mum is not going to come and save you, is she? And
oh,
especially when you go on a voyage, you know that she's definitely not going to come around to save you. You're definitely on your own there. And I guess in a way, every single step he takes after that is kind of bringing him further and further away, both from his home, his mother, his foundation, and into manhood, which of course is the entire point. But I think that very first step is probably always the scariest one, isn't it? On any
Yes.
journey.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right because it can't have been far off, someone saying goodbye to their mum in the 21st century and stepping onto a space shuttle because it's, all that sort of, edge of the world type hazard. And, it wasn't exactly safe going to sea. So yeah, no, that's a good moment. And I think it's one that's often overlooked amidst all the danger and stuff that he encounters later
For
on.
some reason, that just stayed with me, that moment. Was there a moment for you, Andrew, that sort of stayed with you in either the book or the film?
Well, yes, there was one and it was the same moment, and it was in both. And it's when he's carrying out his insane plan to steal the
Ah,
Hispaniola.
yes,
In both the book, I mean, I was quite young when I read it, as you know, and also in the film where it was quite really well done. That really violent and bloody fight between
yes,
Israel Hands and the other sailor. Because reading the book, I was so worried that Jim would accidentally get mixed up in it, and even allowing for the writing style of the late 19th century, Stevenson doesn't really pull any punches about the violence of the
no,
exchange, and the film captures it really well and links directly to that because in a way that fight sets up for this to happen
yes,
when Israel turns on Jim and tries to murder him.
yes.
And I think the biggest nail biting moment for me is when Jim's up in the cross trees, desperately drying his powder and going, "Oh God, oh God, oh God, come on!" There's this very angry man with a very sharp
Yeah.
knife just a few feet away from him.
Oh, I remember that. It was so well written as well. You were really at the edge. It
It
was
was
so-
it was proper page turning stuff. If you told me as a child this book had been published in the 1880s, I'd have gone, no, everything published in that era was really boring.
Oh, dear Lord. And actually, they did it well in the film as well. That moment of him sitting there going, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God."
It's so pulse pounding, and even though I knew how it was all going to
Yes.
end, you still get caught up in that moment, and it just go.
Oh, that is such a good moment. That is such a brilliant moment. Yeah, guys, I wanted to say, share. What's your favorite moment of
Yeah,
the
and
film, the book? You know,
yeah, and if you haven't watched the early 1990s Treasure Island, do watch it. It's an
it's worth it.
absolute treat.
It's definitely worth it. Andrew, how many? I know there was a 1950, is that right, version of Treasure Island. How many other versions of it does exist?
Oh my word, I don't actually know, but I think there've been a couple. And as you alluded to at the beginning, there have been a couple of times where the plot of Treasure Island has been
Yes.
loosely transplanted into other pirate movies. So it becomes a bit of a murky, difficult one
Yes.
to answer. Um,
I
yeah.
I just know there was a version made at some point in the 50s, but I never seen it. And then I know of this one from 1990, but it's one we keep returning to, isn't it?
Oh yes, yeah. I think the charm of Treasure Island will never go away because, and hats off to Stevenson because I think in that book he struck a perfect balance between telling pirates like they were, but also including all the adventurous
Yeah.
things that he just made up, but
Yeah.
look really are really good in a story. And it shows really the fact that this story is so popular even today. I
Yeah.
mean, copies of Treasure Island sell like hotcakes,
Yeah.
and we still, if someone made a new Treasure Island movie tomorrow, I would go and
Yeah.
watch it
Oh,
just
totally,
because.
totally, totally, totally. It no, that some classics become classics for a reason, and he was one of the greatest for a reason. So yes, no, wonderful stuff. Is it on that note, Andrew, that we hand over to people
I
to
think we should, as always, guys. Thank you. You've been so patient listening to us meander across the seven seas,
Oh, yes,
seeking out
yes.
pirates
It
wherever
was
we
so
go. And
fascinating. You're hearing you talk about the Asian history there, Andrew. We must do that more often. I'm going to put you on the spot more often.
oh Lord, well, give me time to read some books first and not look so panicked.
No, that was fascinating stuff. Thank you so much again, Andrew. This was really great.
Oh, thank you, Jane. Really glad of the opportunity. As always, it's lovely to see you, and
And
thank you so much for a really stimulating conversation about pirates and Treasure Island in particular. I really love this one.
everything, and the Caribbean and Asia and everything. And guys, let us know your favorite moment from Treasure Island or from the book. What attracted you? What fascinated you? Any kind of Asian related pirate stories or movies? We would be happy to know about it because our research didn't bring us far there, apart from Andrew's, of course, vast historical knowledge. And but couldn't come across many films really, or TV shows, or anything like that. So let us know if there's anything we've missed.
Yeah. And lastly, at the risk of starting fights, put it down. Best pirate movie ever, in your opinion,
Mm.
guys. We would love to know what is the best pirate movie. I mean, obviously
Definitely,
after Treasure Island, but
definitely the Crimson Pirate. I mean, who can beat Burt Lancaster shirtless for an entire movie? There's absolutely, yeah, don't make that face. There's no debate about this, Andrew.
no. Yeah, yes, yeah, you're absolutely right. Can't argue with that. Yeah.
Anyway, let us know, guys. Let us know and take care. And Andrew, let's do this again soon.
Absolutely. Take care, everyone. Thank you so much. And Jane, thanks again. Lovely to see you as always.